For years, my life had been calm, predictable, and peaceful. I had bought my modest suburban home with the dream of building a life in a community where neighbors looked out for one another and families could grow without unnecessary drama. The streets of my neighborhood were lined with identical homes, each framed by well-trimmed lawns and flower beds that seemed to compete for attention every spring. Children rode their bikes without a care in the world, and most evenings couples could be seen walking their dogs or chatting with one another on front porches. It was the kind of neighborhood people imagined when they thought of the American dream. My routine fit right into this picture. Every morning I woke up, brewed my coffee, and took my dog, Max, for his daily walk. Max was a gentle, well-trained golden retriever, loved by everyone who met him. His wagging tail and calm demeanor made him a favorite among the neighborhood kids, who often asked if they could pet him as we passed by. To me, Max wasn't just a pet. He was family. He had been with me through my toughest moments, and his presence was a reminder of loyalty, love, and comfort. For a long time, everything was perfect. I enjoyed the sense of belonging and community. We had block parties, holiday celebrations, and simple moments of laughter exchanged between neighbors. I knew almost everyone on the street by name, and we treated one another with kindness and respect. But peace, as I would learn, is fragile. Sometimes it only takes one person to shatter it completely. That person came in the form of Karen. When Karen moved into the house next door, I didn't think much of it at first. New neighbors came and went, and I made it a point to introduce myself. On the day she arrived, I walked over with a small basket of cookies as a welcome gift. She accepted them stiffly, barely making eye contact, and muttered a quick thanks before retreating into her home. I brushed it off, assuming she was just overwhelmed with the move. After all, relocating can be stressful. But as weeks passed, I began to notice something unsettling. Karen wasn't just unfriendly, she seemed determined to find problems where none existed. At first it was subtle, a cold stare when I mowed my lawn, a loud sigh when Max barked while playing fetch in the yard. Small gestures that seemed insignificant in isolation, but built up a pattern of discontent. The first official sign of trouble came when I received a note taped to my door. It was written in sharp, hurried handwriting and read, "Your dog barks. Too much. Control it or I'll report you." I remember standing there, note in hand, with a mix of disbelief and frustration. Max wasn't a barker by nature. In fact, compared to most dogs in the neighborhood, he was unusually quiet. Sure, he let out a bark or two when the mailman arrived, but nothing excessive or disruptive. I knew this complaint wasn't about noise, it was about control. Karen had decided she didn't like Max, and she wanted me to know it. I tried to brush it off and continue living my life, but things escalated quickly. Karen began glaring at me whenever I stepped outside with Max. If he so much as trotted across the yard, she would mutter under her breath, shaking her head as though he were some wild beast wreaking havoc on the community. Soon, other neighbors began telling me she had complained to them too, warning them about how dangerous my dog supposedly was. The absurdity of it all would have been laughable if it weren't so stressful. Then came the day everything changed. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. I had just let Max out into the backyard to stretch his legs while I tidied up the kitchen. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, 2 police officers stood on my porch. My heart dropped instantly. "Sir," one of them said, "we received a report about a potentially dangerous dog on your property. We need to check things out." I was stunned. Dangerous dog? Max? My gentle, sweet, tail-wagging golden retriever, who had never harmed a soul. It didn't take a genius to figure out who had made the call. Karen. I invited the officers in, explaining that Max was friendly and fully registered with all the necessary paperwork. Still, the humiliation burned. To have police show up at your door over something so absurd was not only stressful, but also deeply embarrassing. As they inspected Max, who of course greeted them with nothing but wagging enthusiasm, felt my frustration grow. The officers were polite, but their presence carried weight. Neighbors peered out from their windows, curious about what was happening. And just like that, the seed of suspicion was planted, even though the officers left. Without incident, assuring me everything was fine, the damage was already done. Karen had succeeded in making me look like a problem in the eyes of my community. That night, as I sat on my couch with Max resting his head on my lap, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I had always believed in fairness, in living peacefully, without stirring trouble. But Karen had crossed a line. She hadn't just disrupted my day. She had involved law enforcement over a false claim, putting my dog's safety and my reputation at risk. I knew then that this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't going to stop. If anything, she had just begun her campaign of harassment. And if I didn't do something about it, Max and I would be at the mercy of her lies indefinitely. I resolved to protect my home, my peace, and most importantly, my dog. What I didn't know at the time was that uncovering the truth about Karen would lead me down a path I never expected, one that would expose secrets she had desperately tried to keep hidden. And so, with the weight of injustice heavy on my shoulders, I prepared myself for what was coming. The battle with Karen had only just begun. The days after the police visit felt different. Something had shifted, not only in how I looked at my neighborhood, but also in how I looked at Karen. Before, I thought of her as nothing more than a difficult neighbor, unpleasant, maybe even a little bitter, but harmless. But the fact that she was willing to weaponize the police against me over my dog of all things showed me that she was willing to go much further than I had imagined. I couldn't relax anymore. Every time Max barked, even just a single sound, I felt a rush of panic. I would immediately hush him, afraid that Karen was sitting by her window, phone in hand, waiting for another excuse to call the authorities. I began to keep the blinds closed and avoided stepping into the front yard unless absolutely necessary. I hated the way this woman had managed to make me feel like a prisoner in my own home, and it wasn't just me noticing. Other neighbors started treating me differently. The police car parked outside my house that Saturday had been seen by too many people, and though no one said it outright, I could feel the subtle shift in their behavior. Conversations with neighbors were shorter. Greetings were less enthusiastic. The air carried an unspoken tension. Karen's plan had worked. She had planted the idea that something was wrong with me, or with Max, and once that seed is planted, it tends to grow no matter how untrue it is. Karen seemed to thrive in this new role she had created for herself, the neighborhood watchdog. I caught her several times standing outside, pretending to trim her hedges, but really just staring into my yard. Once I saw her holding her phone up, clearly recording Max while he played. Another time, she followed me as I walked down the street with him. Her eyes narrowed as though waiting for him to misbehave. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about noise. This was about control, about her asserting dominance over me and my home. The breaking point came when I received an official notice from the HOA. The letter was neatly typed, addressed to me by name, and claimed that there had been multiple complaints about my dog creating a disturbance in the neighborhood. The notice warned that further violations could result in fines or even mandatory removal of my pet. I remember reading it over and over, my hands shaking with anger. Max wasn't just a pet, he was family. The idea that someone could try to take him away from me because of false accusations was unbearable. I knew then that I couldn't sit back anymore. If Karen wanted to play games, then I would play too. But I would play smarter. I started documenting everything. Every walk, every time Max went outside, every small noise he made, I recorded it. I installed cameras on my property, not only for protection, but also as evidence in case Karen decided to call the police again. I made sure every piece of paperwork for Max was in order. His vaccinations, his registration, his training certificates. If I was going to be attacked, I wanted to make sure I had a shield strong enough to withstand anything Karen threw my way. But the more I dug into my defense, the more curious I became about Karen herself. Why was she doing this? Why was she so obsessed with me and my dog? It wasn't normal behavior, not even for a nosy neighbor. It felt calculated, almost personal, even though we barely knew each other. That curiosity soon turned into investigation. I started small. I asked around the neighborhood, carefully slipping Karen's name into conversations. What I learned didn't surprise me, but it confirmed my suspicions. I wasn't her first target. Apparently, before I moved in, she had clashed with the family across the street over their basketball hoop, claiming it was too noisy. She had fought with another neighbor over their garden, saying the flowers attracted bees and were unsafe. Everywhere she went, Karen left behind a trail of conflict. But what struck me most was when a neighbor mentioned her dog. "Funny thing," one of them said. "I've never seen her take it to the vet. And come to think of it, she never really talks about it being licensed or registered." At first, I brushed the comment aside, but later that night it came back to me with force. Licensing and registering a dog wasn't optional in our county. Every pet had to be documented, vaccinated, and up to date on records. If Karen hadn't followed those rules, she was in violation. The very thing she was accusing me of. The idea stuck in my head like a thorn. Could it be that Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of neighborhood order, was herself breaking the very rules she tried to use against me? Fueled by equal parts anger and curiosity, I decided to find out. I researched county records, digging through the pet registry. I had all of Max's documents on file, so I knew exactly what should appear if Karen had done things correctly. But after several searches, her dog's name never came up. No license, no vaccinations, nothing. I couldn't believe it. The same woman who had tried to paint me as irresponsible, who had involved the police and the HOA, was hiding a major violation in plain sight. It was hypocrisy at its worst. But I didn't rush to act. I knew that if I played my hand too soon, Karen would twist the story and make me look like the aggressor. No, this needed to be done carefully. I needed to build my case, step by step, until the evidence was undeniable. So I kept documenting. I saved the HOA letters, I kept the videos from my cameras, and I quietly gathered proof of Karen's violation. I knew the day would come when her lies would unravel. And when it did, I would be ready. As I lay in bed that night, Max curled up. At my side, I finally felt a flicker of hope. Karen had power because she thrived on fear, on intimidation, and on control. But now I had something she didn't know I had: the truth. And the truth, if handled correctly, was more powerful than any lie she could spread. The war between us wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning, and soon, everyone would see Karen for who she really was. The realization that Karen's dog wasn't even registered gave me a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. For weeks, I had been on the defensive, reacting to her accusations, her notes, her harassment. But now, for the first time, I had leverage. I had discovered something that could shift the balance of power back in my favor. Still, I knew I couldn't act impulsively. If I went to the HOA or authorities with nothing more than suspicion, Karen would spin it as me harassing her in retaliation. I had to be smarter. So I began a methodical routine. Every morning I documented Max's behavior, his walks, his feeding. Times, the short bursts of barking when the mail carrier passed by. I labeled each video file, each entry in my notebook, carefully creating a timeline of proof that Max was no nuisance, no threat, no danger to the community. This was more than defense. It was building a foundation for offense. At the same time, I started watching Karen more closely. She had a small dog, a yappy little terrier that barked far more than Max ever did. I couldn't help but notice the irony whenever it happened. The same woman who had accused me of disturbing the peace lived with a creature whose shrill barks pierced through the neighborhood like nails on a chalkboard. But what was more interesting was that I never once saw her take it to the vet. Never saw a tag on its collar, never saw any sign that it was properly documented. I decided to confirm my suspicion with county records. I logged into the public registry again and searched thoroughly. Max's name, registration number, and vaccinations popped up immediately, as expected. But Karen's dog? Nothing. No license, no rabies vaccination records, no city tag. It was invisible to the system, as if it didn't exist at all. That was my first major piece of evidence. But I knew I needed more. HOA boards and local authorities dealt with endless petty disputes between neighbors. If I went in with flimsy accusations, they might dismiss me as just another angry homeowner. No, I needed Karen's hypocrisy laid bare in such undeniable detail that no one could defend her. So I doubled down. My cameras picked up her dog barking at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night. I captured footage of her dog running, loose without a leash, darting across yards and even digging up flower beds in her own front lawn. I noted every incident and quietly compiled the clips into a folder labeled simply evidence. But Karen wasn't sitting idle either. She continued her campaign of harassment against me with renewed vigor. One day, I came home to find yet another HOA notice, this time claiming I had violated lawn care guidelines. According to the letter, my grass was overgrown and unkempt. I stared at the words in disbelief, glancing at my lawn, trimmed neatly, greener than most of my neighbors. It was obvious who had filed the complaint. Karen was playing dirty, using every rule, every technicality, every ounce of influence. She could muster to paint me as a rule breaker. I realized then that Karen wasn't just motivated by annoyance or dislike of dogs. This was personal. For some reason, she had chosen me as her enemy, and she wasn't going to stop until she broke me down. But if she thought I was going to crumble, she was mistaken. The turning point came one evening when I saw Karen outside, arguing with a delivery driver. Her terrier was barking incessantly at the man, lunging at the end of its leash, teeth bared. The driver, clearly rattled, refused to approach the porch and left the package at the curb instead. Karen scolded the driver, yelling something about incompetence, before dragging her dog back inside. That moment stuck with me. Karen had called my dog dangerous, but hers was the one showing actual aggression. I went back through my footage, pulling out every clip that showed her terrier barking, growling, or lunging. I compared it to the videos of Max, who spent most of his days calmly lounging in the yard or wagging his tail during walks. The contrast was striking. By now, my file against Karen was growing thick. I had screenshots of the county registry proving her dog wasn't listed. I had video clips of her terrier disturbing the peace. I had documented every false complaint she had filed against me. Piece by piece, I was assembling a puzzle that painted a very different picture than the one she was trying to sell to the neighborhood. But I also knew Karen. She was cunning, manipulative, and relentless. If I presented my case too early, she'd twist the narrative, claiming I was harassing her, stalking her, or retaliating. I had to bide my time, wait for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, I returned, home to find yet another notice on my door. This one was more severe than the others. It stated that due to repeated violations, the HOA was considering fining me for Max's alleged disturbances. My heart sank as I read the words. Despite all my documentation, all my effort to stay above board, Karen's influence had reached the HOA board directly. For a moment, I felt the crushing weight of defeat. Was I fighting a battle I couldn't win? Karen seemed to have allies, or at least enough sway to push the board into action against me. But then something unexpected happened. Later that evening, a neighbor approached me quietly. He had lived down the street for years and had witnessed more of Karen's antics than most. "I don't know what she's told the board," he said, "but I've seen your dog. He's not the problem. If you need me to testify or write a statement, I will." His words reignited my determination. Maybe Karen had convinced some people, but not everyone. Some of my neighbors still saw the truth. And with their support, plus the evidence I had gathered, I realized I might not only defend myself, but also expose Karen for the fraud she was. That night, I sat at my desk and began organizing everything into a structured file. One section for false complaints, one for Max's records, one for Karen's unregistered dog, and one for video evidence. It was time to move from defense to offense. The next HOA meeting was only a week away, and I knew that when the time came, I would be ready to reveal everything. What I didn't know, however, was just how explosive that meeting would turn out to be. The days leading up to the HOA meeting felt like walking on a tightrope. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel Karen's eyes on me. She had this habit of pretending to do yard work whenever I walked Max, but it was obvious she was watching, waiting for the smallest slip-up she could pounce on. Max, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him, would trot happily at my side, his tail wagging as if nothing was wrong. I envied his innocence. Inside, however, my home had transformed into a war room. My dining table was covered with neat stacks of papers, HOA notices, my written logs of Max's behavior, screenshots of county records showing Karen's dog missing, from the registry, and USB drives filled with video footage from my security cameras. I had built a fortress of evidence, and I intended to use every brick of it. Still, the pressure weighed heavily on me. The HOA's most recent notice hadn't been a warning. It had been a clear statement that fines were being considered. That was the first step toward something far worse, forced removal of Max. I couldn't even bear to imagine it. The thought of losing him because of Karen's lies kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling, my fists clenched in frustration. But the more the fear gnawed at me, the stronger my determination grew. Karen thought she could bully me into submission, but what she didn't realize was that she had awakened a side of me that refused to back down. I had always considered myself a reasonable, non-confrontational person, but when it came to protecting Max, there was no line I wouldn't cross. I began rehearsing my presentation for the HOA meeting like a lawyer preparing for trial. I spoke aloud to an empty room, explaining how the police visit had been based on false claims, how my documentation showed Max was no disturbance, and how Karen herself was in violation of multiple HOA and county rules. I timed myself, refined my points, and made sure that my evidence was undeniable. But in the middle of all this preparation, something unexpected happened that gave me an even stronger weapon. Late one evening, I heard a commotion outside. Curious, I stepped onto my porch and saw Karen across the street, struggling to control her terrier. The dog had gotten loose from its leash and was darting across yards, barking furiously. Karen was yelling, chasing after it, while neighbors looked on from their porches in annoyance. I didn't even have to move. My cameras captured the entire event in crystal clear detail. Karen's dog barking uncontrollably, running across multiple properties, ignoring her commands and generally causing chaos. The irony of it all was staggering. This was the same woman who had accused Max of being a disturbance and a danger. Yet here was undeniable proof that her dog was the real problem. I saved the footage immediately, labeling it carefully in my evidence folder. This was the missing piece, the kind of evidence that would turn the tide completely in my favor. Not only was her dog unregistered, but it was also a genuine nuisance caught red-handed in front of half the neighborhood. The following day, I quietly reached out to a few neighbors who had witnessed the event. I asked if they would be willing to confirm what they had seen. To my relief, several agreed. People were tired of Karen's antics. They had tolerated her long enough, and this latest outburst from her dog had pushed many of them over the edge. With witnesses on my side, I felt more confident than ever, but I didn't let that confidence blind me. I knew Karen would come to the HOA meeting prepared with her usual arsenal of lies and exaggerations. She would twist words, manipulate emotions, and try to make herself appear as the victim. That was her specialty, turning her aggression into a shield of false innocence. So I planned not just to defend myself, but to dismantle her credibility, piece by piece. As the HOA meeting drew closer, the tension in the neighborhood grew palpable. I caught snippets of conversations as I walked Max, whispers about drama at the meeting, and Karen going after the guy with the golden retriever. Some people avoided eye contact, unwilling to get involved, but others gave me subtle nods of encouragement, silent acknowledgments that they knew the truth. Finally, the night of the meeting arrived. I walked into the community center with my folder of evidence tucked firmly under my arm, Max's registration papers in one hand, and the USB drive in my pocket. My heart was pounding, but my resolve was unshakable. The room was filled with neighbors, HOA board members seated at a long table in the front. Karen was already there, sitting in the front row, her arms crossed and a smug expression plastered on her face. She didn't even look at me as I took my seat, but I could feel her satisfaction radiating like a poison. The meeting began with routine matters, budget updates, landscaping projects, minor rule clarifications. But everyone in the room knew what they were really there for. The tension was electric, building as the agenda inched closer to resident disputes. When my case was finally brought up, Karen was the first to speak. She launched into a dramatic monologue about how Max was a constant disturbance, how his barking was unbearable, and how she feared for the safety of the neighborhood. She even dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, as if the stress of living next to me had driven her to the brink of tears. It was an Oscar-worthy performance, designed to tug at the board's sympathies. For a brief moment, I saw some heads nodding, and my stomach twisted. But I reminded myself I had the truth. When it was my turn to speak, I stood tall and laid out my case calmly and methodically. I presented Max's paperwork first, his license, his vaccinations, his training records. Then I showed my logs, carefully documenting his behavior. Next, I played the video footage from my cameras. Evidence of Max's calm demeanor contrasted with clips of Karen's terrier barking uncontrollably, running off leash and causing chaos. Finally, I revealed the county registry, highlighting the absence of Karen's dog from the official records. The room shifted. I could feel it. The smugness drained from Karen's face as whispers spread through the audience. Board members exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by the thoroughness of my evidence. But the true blow came when one of my neighbors stood up and confirmed what they had seen: Karen's dog running loose, barking at night and disturbing the peace. One after another, more neighbors chimed in, sharing their own experiences of her harassment and double standards. By the time I finished, the entire room had turned. Karen's tissue was crumpled in her hand, but the tears had dried. She tried to interject, to spin the story back in her favor, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The more she spoke, the more transparent her lies became. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. Justice wasn't just possible, it was finally within reach. But deep down, I knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. People like her rarely did, and the fallout from this meeting would only be the beginning. The silence after the HOA meeting was deafening. For a moment, no one knew what to say. My evidence hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and undeniable. Karen sat stiffly in her chair, her jaw clenched, eyes darting around the room as if searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But this time, no one came to her rescue. The board members shuffled papers, their once stern expressions now softened into something closer to embarrassment. They had nearly fined me, nearly punished me for crimes that never existed. And now, in front of the entire neighborhood, the truth had been revealed. Karen's campaign had been nothing more than a web of lies, and her own hypocrisy was laid, bare for everyone to see. One of the board members cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the documentation presented tonight," he said, his voice steady, but noticeably less confident than before. "It's clear that the complaints filed against Max," he glanced at my dog's name on the paperwork, "were not substantiated. In fact, we see evidence that contradicts those claims entirely." The words were like a release valve. The tension in my chest eased, though I kept my expression calm. This wasn't about gloating, it was about survival, about finally having the truth acknowledged. Another board member leaned forward. "Furthermore," she added, "it has come to our attention that certain requirements have not been met by another resident's pet." Her eyes shifted pointedly toward Karen. The murmurs in the room swelled like a rising tide. Karen's face flushed red. "That's ridiculous!" she snapped, her voice shrill. "My dog is perfectly fine. He's never caused any issues. This is just retaliation, that's all." "You're all being manipulated." But her words rang hollow. The board had the evidence, the neighbors had spoken, and the longer she ranted, the more unhinged she appeared. Finally, the head of the board raised his hand for silence. "Karen," he said firmly, "the registry records are clear. Your dog is not licensed, nor is there any record of vaccinations. This is a direct violation of both HOA policy and county law. We will be issuing a formal notice. Failure to comply will result in fines and potential legal action." The room erupted into whispers again, but this time the energy wasn't directed at me. It was directed at her. The mighty Karen, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood, the woman who had policed every minor infraction, was now the one facing punishment. For a brief moment, I almost felt pity for her. Almost. But then I remembered the humiliation of the police at my door, the fear of losing Max, the stress of her constant harassment. No, this was justice, plain and simple. The meeting wrapped up shortly after, but the fallout was only beginning. As people filed out of the room, I overheard snippets of conversation. "Can you believe she lied about all that? I knew her dog was the problem, not his. She's been causing trouble for years." Finally, someone stood up to her. I walked home that night with Max trotting happily at my side, his tail wagging as if he sensed the victory. The cool night air felt different, lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted from the entire neighborhood. But I knew Karen wouldn't simply disappear. People like her rarely accepted defeat gracefully. Sure enough, the next few days were filled with awkward encounters. I'd catch Karen outside, her glare like daggers in my direction. She no longer shouted or left notes. She knew she had lost that battle, but the silence was almost more unnerving. It was the silence of someone plotting, of someone who refused to admit the truth, even when it was staring them in the face. Still, the tide had turned. Neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped to chat. A few even apologized for believing Karen's lies. "We should have known better," one woman admitted. "Max is the sweetest dog on the street." Their words didn't erase the stress of the past months, but they did restore a little of the community spirit I thought I had lost forever. And Karen? Her reputation crumbled faster than I could have imagined. The woman who had once strutted through the neighborhood with an air of superiority now found doors closing in her face. People avoided her at gatherings. Conversations went silent when she approached, and the sympathetic ear she had relied on to spread her complaints had dried up completely. The HOA followed through with their warning, issuing fines for her unregistered dog. Rumor had it she fought tooth and nail, arguing with board members, writing angry letters, even threatening legal action. But none of it mattered. The evidence was too strong, and the law too clear. She either had to comply or face escalating penalties. I heard through the grapevine that she finally caved, registering her dog and paying the overdue fees, but by then the damage to her image was irreversible. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of the neighborhood, had been exposed as a hypocrite, and no one was eager to hear her complaints anymore. One afternoon, as I walked Max past her house, I saw her standing on her porch. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Her glare was as sharp as ever, but there was something else there now, something that looked suspiciously like defeat. She turned away quickly, retreating inside without a word. That moment felt like closure. Not because Karen had suddenly become a better person, she hadn't, but because she no longer had the power to control my life. Her lies had been dismantled, her influence shattered, and her reign of harassment finally broken. For the first time in months, I could breathe again. I could walk Max without fear of police knocking at my door, without dreading another false complaint. The neighborhood felt like home once more, not a battlefield. And though I knew Karen would never forgive me for exposing her, I didn't need her forgiveness. I didn't even need her friendship. All I needed was the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. The battle was over, and for the first time, I had truly won. But as I sat on my porch that evening, Max curled contentedly at my feet. I couldn't help but wonder, had Karen really given up, or was she simply waiting for her next chance? The weeks that followed felt like the calm after a storm. For the first time in months, I could wake up without that knot of anxiety in my stomach. No more anonymous letters taped to my door. No more phone calls from the HOA demanding explanations for fabricated crimes. And most importantly, no more threats to take Max away. Still, even in the quiet, Karen's shadow lingered. She hadn't spoken to me since the HOA meeting, but her presence was impossible to ignore. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of her from my window, standing on her porch, arms crossed, scanning the street like a watchful hawk. Other times I'd hear the faint slam of her front door when I passed by with Max, a not-so-subtle reminder that she still despised me. But the thing was, her power was gone. Her voice carried no weight anymore. The neighbors who once whispered behind closed doors now openly avoided her. People who used to nod politely when she gave them orders now rolled their eyes or walked away. Karen had become the outcast she had always tried to make others feel like. The HOA's ruling had only been the beginning of her downfall. When she refused to pay the first round of fines for her unregistered dog, the board escalated matters. Notices were sent, penalties increased. And when Karen tried to storm into the next meeting, shouting about conspiracies and unfair treatment, she was met with firm, cold resistance. The same board she once manipulated now saw her for what she was, a bully. Word spread quickly that she was on the verge of legal trouble if she didn't comply. Eventually, begrudgingly, Karen caved. She registered her dog, paid the fines, and submitted the paperwork she should have filed years ago. But the damage was irreversible. She wasn't the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood anymore. She was just another resident, and one that most people wished would move away. For me, life slowly returned to normal. Max and I fell back into our old routines. Morning walks down the block, evenings on the porch, lazy weekends in the yard. I found myself smiling more, laughing even, as the weight of Karen's harassment faded into memory. The neighborhood, too, seemed to breathe easier. There was less tension in the air, fewer arguments at HOA meetings, and more casual conversations at block gatherings. Without Karen dominating every discussion, people had room to simply live. It felt like a community again, not a battleground. But even in her silence, Karen never completely disappeared. I'd see her occasionally at the mailbox or driving past, in her car, and every time her glare burned into me. She never apologized, never admitted fault. That wasn't in her nature, and honestly, I didn't expect it. People like Karen rarely change. What did change, however, was me. Before all of this, I would have described myself as quiet, even passive. I avoided conflict whenever possible, kept my head down, and hoped problems would resolve themselves. But Karen taught me a painful lesson. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't just an option, it's a necessity. If I hadn't fought back, if I hadn't gathered the evidence and spoken up, I might have lost Max. I might have lost my peace, my home, my sanity. Now, I understood the value of resilience. I had faced a nightmare I never expected, and I had survived. More than survived, I had won. Neighbors who once barely knew my name now stopped to chat. Some even thanked me. "You did what we all wanted to do but never had the courage for," one man admitted. "You showed her she couldn't push everyone around." Their words humbled me, but they also filled me with pride. For once, I wasn't just the quiet dog owner at the end of the street. I was the person who had stood up to Karen and come out stronger on the other side. One crisp evening, months after the ordeal had ended, I sat on my porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed with shades of gold and crimson, and Max lay curled at my feet, his steady breathing a reminder of everything I had fought for. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, exactly as it should be. That's when it hit me. Karen no longer mattered. Her bitterness, her lies, her glares from across the street, they were powerless now. She had been exposed, and her reign of intimidation was over. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her friendship. All I needed was the life I had rebuilt, stronger than before. And so, as the final light of day slipped below the horizon, I whispered a silent promise to myself. Never again would I let someone like Karen steal my peace. Never again would I stand quietly while someone tried to take what I loved most. Max stirred at my feet, stretching lazily before resting his head back down. I reached down, scratched behind his ears, and smiled. We had been through the storm together, and together we had come out on the other side, not just unbroken, but unshakable. The nightmare was over. The neighborhood was ours again. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the future looked bright.